Hello and welcome to chapter 6 of the Complete King's Indian Masterclass. Today we're exploring the Samisch, which is f3 on move 5. As always, we're going to be covering all of the lines that you need to know to successfully play this with the black side. I will also, as always, be attaching a PGN file in the description so you can follow along with the theory. So the first thing that I'll begin by stating is that against the Samisch and many other sidelines, I'm going to be recommending a c5 based approach. Now, the reason for this is that the Samisch, along with the other sidelines, are a direct response to e5 King's Indian setups. The reason they're not going for the main line is that invites e5. They're trying to play an approach which is going to be better suited against e5. Namely, in the Samisch, White's idea is to go bishop e3, queen d2, and at the face of e5, go bishop to h6 and get kingside play while White is going to basically hold in the center by at some point playing d5. So this is White's idea. So instead of inviting and playing into this idea, we're going to go c5. We're going to try to avoid this. Now, not yet. We first want to get our king safe, but c5 is on the table, and this is what we play on this move. So bishop e3, c5. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that the move f3 comes at a pretty big cost. These pieces have huge issues developing. The knight can't come to f3, and when it develops to e2, it's blocking in the bishop. And so that is our main advantage in this sort of position. Now, after c5, and this is kind of the starting point of our analysis, White has three fundamentally different options that will lead to three very unique positions. They can choose to take this pawn, and this is actually a pawn sacrifice that we're going to be okay giving this pawn on c5. The second option that White has is to push, and now we kind of transform into a Benoni or Banco style position where our plans are quite straightforward. We want to push for b5 along with pushing for e6 to chip away at the pawn center that White has accumulated. The final option that White has is to play a move like knight e2, kind of waiting around, keeping the position and the tension as is. So we're going to be looking at all of these, and let's begin with this one right here because it's the most harmless, it's the least important one, it's very, the least critical one to understand. We go knight to c6, we add more pressure, and the issue for White is they have to make a decision. They either have to take the pawn, which is actually going to transpose directly into that variation that we first talked about of them taking the pawn sacrifice, and you'll see exactly how this transposes when we get to that variation. They can push, which again will lead to very similar Benoni style positions, or in theory they could continue to keep the status quo and play a move like knight to g3, but then they are very on the verge of losing because we already have some huge pressure in the center. So there's going to be some tactical issues with a plan like this. For example, knight g4 here. Already a nice blow, we're hitting the bishop, and after they take, we're going to regain that material with interest. Look at how we are ruining their pawn structure, and queen a5, and material is equal, but black is already winning. So White really needs to early on make a committal decision of d5 or taking. So those are the ones that we are going to mainly focus on. And now let's look at d5, which is, in my opinion, kind of in the middle. It's not the most critical. That would be taking here. That's the one that you really have to know. But it's also an important variation that we should spend some time and explore. And we're going to do so by looking at a game that Hikaru Nakamura played with the black side. So let's just do that. So a6 is played here. As I mentioned, in these variations, in these pawn structures, our main plan consists of breaking through on the queen side with b5, along with breaking in the center with e6. So this is what you see Hikaru going for. We have castles, and this is kind of weird, castling long here, but it is kind of logical in the sense that the pieces just don't have the time to develop effectively, and so White needs to get their king safe, so castling long is a necessity. It's not a move that White really wants to play because the downside is we're getting a huge attack against their pretty vulnerable king. So h4, White is trying by all costs to counterattack us on the king side, but they're a little bit too slow, especially when we play h5 and kind of delay that. And I'm going to kind of let this game speak for itself. Again, Hikaru Nakamura playing here. You can see that the moves are very natural, right? We're bringing our pieces into the game. c3, you cannot take twice here as White because the queen will hang in view of the exposed king. And so already black is making a huge amount of progress on this side of the board. Rook to b2. I mean, this is dangerous, guys, and I think everyone can kind of get the sense here. White is accumulating an attack on this side of the board. Okay, sure, but look at this. I mean, we're already crashing through. So in this position, white decided to take the pawn. Notice we can't really take the queen because they're going to fork us and win a lot of material in exchange. And so we take back the pawn, and Hikaru brings more pieces into the attack on this side of the board. At this point, black is completely winning, and after queen takes g6, Hikaru found the pretty simple mate. He didn't actually play in the most precise way, but this is certainly sufficient to win, and indeed win he did. A nice mate to finish it off. So that's kind of a very brief overview of these positions. There are some more things that I want to look at when it comes to d5. For example, I also want to look after e6, instead of castling long, which as I mentioned, it's not so typical, I want to look at what happens if they take this pawn. Now, if they take this pawn, they're going to try to put pressure on d6. That's kind of where they're going to try to get their play from. But we go queen a5, and it's one of those things where they don't have the time because of their lack in development to just take this pawn. It's not a move that they can afford to do here, and namely, knight to d7 punishes that very effectively. There's pressure on c3, very hard pressure to defend. Bishop d2 is a very passive move, but now simply knight to c6. The knight is coming into the game, our rook will come into the game on the d file, and black is gaining quite a bit of compensation for the pawn that they lost. In fact, they already regained that pawn with the black side. So this is not something that is good for white. Black is completely winning. Look at these pieces sleeping on the back rank. And the queen that is now, in fact, stranded on our side of the board and pretty weak and vulnerable. So that's a variation that I wanted to explore if they were to take. A final option is them playing knight to g2, keeping the tension and looking to at some point get their pieces out and castle kingside. This is kind of the final option that white has in these variations. But once again, you see that they're too slow, right? They had to play a4 to stop us from going b5 and running them over. But now the knight is already coming into the position. Now they can move the knight and control the c4 square to not allow knight c4. So now we can actually play h5. We can, for the time being, abandon our idea temporarily on the queen side and actually just annoy this knight. And now you can really see the issues of them developing. I mean, this is really highlighted now because h4 is a huge threat, which would basically force the knight back to come and block the bishop. Here, for example, after bishop e2, the knight is forced back all the way to f1. And, we can even continue here by going h3 and continuing to run them over. We could, for the time being, continue with our attack on the queen side. We're playing on both sides of the board and playing holistically in a way which is very effective. And look at this king. It's not castling anytime soon. So these are the d5 variations. I think that what you'll see is that we get pretty good play with both of the ideas of playing in the center, playing on the queen side, and as you saw, sometimes sneaking up this h-pawn and playing on the king side. Let's now look at the main line, the critical variation. This is possibly the most precise option that white has, in the sense that you need to know what to do here. If you don't play accurately, you could just be losing because you are down a pawn, and that is a serious concession at such an early stage. But as I said, objectively and practically, we're doing completely fine if you know what to do, because of the compensation in the form of the developmental issues that white has. So in this position, there are three important moves to consider. There is kind of a random move that white can play, which is bishop a3, and their idea is to preemptively address the issue of knight to d7, which is our next idea to attack the bishop. So knight to c6 was to defend, but our main idea is to go knight to d7 to attack the bishop and open up our own bishop and reroute the knight into the game. And you're going to see this idea of just taking over the position with our knights. So knight to c6 defending, but we want to go knight to d7, so bishop a3 is one option they have. Now they can also go and play a move like knight e2, and we're going to explore this as well. Once again, knight to d7, this is what we're going for. But the most critical option is knight to d5, and here, ladies and gentlemen, unbelievably, we are sacrificing another pawn. So let's begin by looking at knight to e2. We're going to go knight to d7. Their bishop retreats, and now we reroute the knight to e5, and our idea is to take control of the light squares. So one threat is to come knight to d3, which would already be very problematic for white, so they have to move their knight to stop that. But now we go knight b4, and you can see by the arrows here, there are quite a bit of ideas for us in this position. We have the initiative. So in this position, rook to c1, trying to stop this idea of bringing the knight in, but bishop h6 bringing a final piece into the attack, and we are taking over the board with all of our pieces. One threat is to take and then bring the knight to d3. If their knight came to d5, this is what happened in the game that we're following. We're going to take and now bring the knight in, and we win the exchange. This is Hikaru playing with the black side, so you have an exchange for a pawn. Black is already much better. Now, admittedly, Hikaru did not convert this endgame as well as he could have, and he gave white more counterplay than was necessary. But suffice it to say that, I mean, in the end, black did indeed win, and this endgame is completely winning. And black had no issues to convert and win the game. Of course, the endgame and even that middle game is not really what we're focusing on, because we already got an advantage from the opening, so our job is done. So now in this position, let's look at the move bishop a3, a secondary sideline that white has. Again, preemptively trying to avoid the big issue of knight to d7, and so we don't go knight to d7. It's not nearly as effective because it doesn't come with tempo. We have this new plan, though, of going a5 and taking advantage of the bishop on a3 and the forkable square on c2. Now that the bishop is on a3, it becomes even more juicy. So this is our main idea here, and it's actually difficult to stop this idea. We're going to develop our pieces naturally, bishop e6. We're going to bring the knight to b4. Again, material doesn't matter here. Give them the pawn. Who cares? We're getting so much play in exchange for that pawn. Look at this, knight c2, knight a3. We can now go b5, distracting the pawn from the defense of the knight. And after takes, I mean, black is completely winning here. Look at the disparity in piece activity. Every piece for black is in the game and active. They have so many weaknesses as white, and their pieces are sleeping on the back rank, and it's difficult to get them into the game. And something like this, ladies and gentlemen, is just complete game over. I mean, the knight is pinned now. We can very simply add another attacker to that knight. We can go g5 at some point, and then I mean, it's game over. There's not much more that needs to be said. Black is winning. So that's kind of my recommendation against bishop a3. It's a very specific move, but it has been played quite a bit of times, and a5 and knight b4 is a nice thematic idea to put into your toolbox. Now I've avoided the issue, the elephant in the room, for long enough. Let's look at the main line, knight to d5. And ladies and gentlemen, here we're sacrificing a second pawn. We're going to go knight to d7 anyways, and they have the luxury of picking with what piece to take this extra pawn. So let's look at the main line, which is bishop takes e7. We're going to take back, and the big form of compensation that we have in this position is the two bishops advantage. And that means that white might be tempted to get rid of our two bishop advantage, but this comes at a deadly cost, because we can first take the pawn here, but ultimately we're going to take back this knight after, let's say, something like this. And look at this position. I mean, we're down a pawn, but it doesn't seem like we're any worse. Objectively, we're much better practically as well. The knight is coming to e5. It's going to sink its teeth into the position here. There's already pressure on this pawn. This is so good for us. I mean, this is like a dream position in the Samisch. So after bishop takes, knight takes, the knight tends to return back to d5. This is practically and objectively best for white. And what they're claiming is that the knight here is kind of annoying, which it is, and it's not going to allow us to get as much counterplay as we want. But we're still going to try, and as you're going to see, black tends to be fine in these positions. We're going to take the pawn first on b2. They're going to go rook b1. We're going to bring the bishop back. So we're only down one pawn, and we have a huge advantage of the two bishops. Now, how you exactly navigate these positions is in many ways a matter of taste. One of the plans that you have is to just put pressure on this weak pawn on c4. Another idea sometimes is to bring the rook over and attack this pawn like this. So let's look at some of these ideas in action. After knight h3, we can go knight to c5. We're putting pressure, stopping the bishop from being able to develop to d3. And also, we're adding pressure onto this knight. And so if the bishop just comes to e2, we're happy to get rid of our two bishops, sure, but we have quite a bit of compensation. As I mentioned, rook d6, this idea comes into play. We're dominating here. The knight can come at some point to f4, maybe to e4, maybe to g4 and g5, and just put pressure on these pawns on the king side. we have some good play here. And so their most common option is in fact to go knight f2 here and not give us the opportunity to get rid of that knight on h3. And here we can go b6, and here we can kind of utilize that secondary idea where we're going to eventually get a rook to the c file and just play on this open file, and both of our rooks being strong. And this is one of those positions where visually it might not look all that impressive because of this beast of a knight here, but we can play around that knight. We can use this maneuver, for example, which is quite effective. We're hitting the bishop, we're hitting the pawn, we're already winning here, and this is kind of the only way that white can generate play, this idea of going a4, a5. Otherwise, like, they have no ideas in this position because our two bishops are really strong. We give them no options to attack us. So, you know, it's a very difficult position to navigate. The engine prefers black here, even though we're down a pawn, but we have the two bishops. We have ideas to kind of jump around in this position on the dark squares. At some point, you know, we have pressure on c4. That could be a very big entry point for our pieces. We're doing very well here. So let's go back now and focus on the second option, which is knight takes on e7. And the positions that arise in this variation, after bishop takes b2, they have to move their rook. We go bishop c3 check. We can go bishop d4, and you can see that white often will opt for this repetition here, because this is often their best option objectively speaking. They can try to run to g3, but now we can go simply rook to e8. We're attacking the bishop, and after the bishop retreats, now we can continue launching our pieces forward. Knight h5 is an idea. Our bishop is cutting them. We're actually gonna try to mate them here. As surprising as that seems, there's no queen on the board, but a queen is not very necessary. Bishop f2, g3, we can go f6, the bishop comes back, and now knight to g7, and g5 is already an idea. Not really mate because they can sack the piece, but okay, at the very least, g5 is a move that is a huge threat that will win a ton of material, and black is already like -5. We're already crushing on the board. I do want to mention that an alternative for white is to take our rook, and we're going to take their rook, but this is a huge drawing endgame. I mean, we're down a pawn, but because of our lead in development, we have sufficient compensation for that pawn. And for example, knight e2 can come. We can now go and play knight b6 and hit on c4. Let's say they go knight f4. We can then go and play, you know, bishop e5, just centralize our pieces. They get their bishop out. We get our bishop out. You know, we're hitting their bishop. They're encouraged to take. I mean, they can retreat, let's say bishop h4, but now rook to c8, and you can see that we're going to win back the pawn, right? Like at some point they're probably, well, they can't even castle, but at some point they're probably going to forfeit this pawn, give us back the material, and then we're going to have that extra advantage of piece development and piece activity. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to finish our video on the Samisch. In this critical variation of knight to d5, what you notice is that bishop takes is usually not so scary because we end up having the two bishop advantage, and knight takes is usually not so scary because we get either a huge attack on the king if it chooses to run to g3, or we get a very drawish and very calm endgame where we are certainly not worse. And outside of these variations, let's say they choose not to take, as a quick reminder, if they go for a move like d5, our ideas are plentiful. We can play on all sides of the board with many different ideas. We have a lot of energy that we can bring into the position, and it all comes down to the simple fact that white is struggling, very much so, to develop their pieces, and that is our compensation in a position that even without that point is still pretty good for black. So we're doing fine here. And in general, against the Samisch, we're doing pretty well with this c5 based approach. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe if you're new around here. Like this video if you learned something new from it. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.